All right, so ladies and gentlemen, we are live. We are broadcasting on Facebook. Hopefully somebody's watching us. So again, for those on Facebook, welcome to the Lambs. We're America's oldest professional theatrical club. Tonight we're broadcasting live streaming, and our discussion tonight is going to be about Jack Benny. I'd like to welcome our partner in tonight's event, Harvardwood, Spence Porter.
So much fun to have seen from the rear, because of course I can see nobody pass in the front row with those lights shining in my eye, but I know you're there. And so for those of you who are wondering, Harvardwood is Harvard's officially recognized organization for the arts, media, and entertainment. And I'm just so pleased about tonight's event. I was thinking about Jack Benny on the way up here and realized that there's a very real paradox to him as a performer, because the character he played should not be appealing. You know, stingy, vain. Who would like such a person? But everybody loved him, and I think the secret behind it, and this is paradoxical too, because we would normally call this bad acting. It wasn't. But you felt that there was an underlying person who was tremendously kind and warm. And that enabled the character to simply be funny. And I think Brecht can probably explain that better than Stanislavski. But I am so pleased that Jack Benny's daughter, Joan Benny, has agreed to appear tonight to talk about him. We were originally going to have the wonderful Foster Hirsch as interviewer, but Foster developed a last-minute conflict, and we found the perfect replacement, because she had already read Joan's out-of-print book. Yeah. And was already eagerly planning to attend this evening. And Martha Steketee, you know, those are in a sense her most important credentials for this. But I'll give you some of the other credentials. She's on the board of the League of Professional Theater Women. She's on the executive committees of both Literary Managers and Dramaturgs of America and the American Theater Critics Association. I had a lot of fun trying to memorize all those words in the right order. And she has written extensively about the golden age of Hollywood. So she really is the perfect interviewer for this. And so let's welcome Martha Steketee and Joan Benny.
As she makes her way up. We're all friends. We'd like to. Yes, it's great. Just look at each other. So, we don't have microphones. We don't have microphones, so we'll just project. I'll try. We're going to have to share everything. I came across this book. By the way, I was doing work with the relative of somebody who worked in MGM in the 40s and 50s. And she was attempting to, and she'd grown up with this relative, this person, and she was trying to figure out how to structure a memoir where she had some pages that her relative had left that didn't really make a memoir. And she had her own memories of some of the same people that her aunt had worked with. And a number of people said, you should look at Joan Benny's memoir that she wrote, and it came out in 1990, right? It's not just about her father, it's about her, and it's a beautifully kind of integrated stylistically. So she, and you can correct me now, so the stories you came across after your father passed away, a memoir that he was
Well, I I did know about it. I do recall some years before he died, he was writing this with a ghostwriter, whose name at the moment I don't remember. And they did the whole thing, and then for some reason, he didn't want to publish it. I think it had something to do with my mother didn't want it published. So it was never published. I, of course, totally forgot about it. And it wasn't until after my mother died, and that was 10 years after my father, that I found it in a closet and going through their things. And it was like, oh, I remember when he wrote this, but I forgot. Anyway, so now I have this memoir. But it wasn't really long enough or detailed enough to publish by itself. I read it through a couple of times. There were also some sections in it that I thought would no longer be relevant, or he did a whole chapter about a writer who had worked for him way back in the 20s, who had long since died, and nobody would remember, and it just wasn't all that interesting to the public. So here I had something that was maybe altogether 100 pages. Oh, Martha, that reminds me, when my book, this book, was reviewed, a criticism was that I hadn't used enough of my father's autobiography.
They want to hear about you. They just want to hear about you.
Well, the fact is that I used all of it, but I made the mistake, and my editor didn't pick it up. I made the mistake of saying that I had come across a 300-page memoir. Well, yes, it was 300 pages, but it was triple spaced. A lot of blank pages in between chapters that were blank pages. It was nowhere near 300 pages, but I stupidly said 300 pages, and as I said, my editor didn't pick up on it, but the reviewers did.
So they thought there was gold that somewhere.
Yeah, they thought that there's all this stuff that I had left out, and I didn't leave anything out except a chapter about an old writer that nobody would care about. So in going through this, there was a lot of interesting things, and I thought people would very much like to read about my father, but there wasn't enough. And I thought, well, what about if I talked about my life with father and interspersed it with his recollections, with his, my recollections of my childhood and so on. So that's how it came about. It took me a long time to get to this because my father died in 1974, and this wasn't published till 1990. The reason being, although I had been approached by publishers, I kept saying, I don't think so. Who wants to read a book about a nice man? This is not Mommy Dearest. It was a long time before I finally said, well, okay, if I can do it my way with my story and his, maybe I'll give it a try.
And you actually just mentioned something, we'll just say this at the top and go past it, because you used this phrase when we had lunch last week. You said you weren't going to write Mommy Dearest, and you weren't interested in doing that at all. Your relationship with your mom wasn't particular, or you were challenged in how to write about your mother, you described.
Very much.
But you were helped out by a family friend.
And George Burns.
Yes, yeah. Other
Excuse
people.
me. I didn't want to do Mommy Dearest. It was very hard for me to say negative things about my mother, and particularly because people remember Mary Livingston and her wonderful laugh, and I think the public remembers her as being, it was Jack Benny and Mary Livingston, and wasn't she wonderful? And George Burns wrote 2 or 3 books about his life with Gracie, and as you may know, he was my father's best friend, and he and Gracie and my parents were together a great deal. Well, apparently, and I'd never discussed it with him, apparently George and Gracie did not like my mother at all. And he talks about it in a couple of his books. He says a couple of kind of unkind things. And I called him and I said, oh, thank you, Natty. His name, by the way, was Nathan Birnbaum. And people who knew George Burns well called him Natty. And Gracie was Googie. So in the social world of Hollywood, they were Natty and Googie. True. So I called Natty and I said, thank you. He said, what for? I said, thank you for saying what you did about my mother because you opened the door. Now, if I say something negative, it's not like nobody has said this before. So it made it a little easier.
Thank you. I just wanted to, thanks. I wanted to talk about, we're going to talk about your dad primarily and you and your life and how they kind of they intersected. So let's talk about, so you came to your parents in 19 whatever. They adopted you.
They adopted
Here in
me.
New York.
And it's no longer, I mean, it's been published, so I can hardly keep it a secret, much as I would love to lie about my age. I was born in 1934, which makes me 82.
God love you.
Hard to even consider. I was adopted, I imagine, when I was a week or two old, because I certainly don't remember it. And I've done a lot of lecturing around the country about growing up in Hollywood, about my life with my family. And the most frequently asked questions are, and I'll do them for you, was he cheap? The answer is no. Oh, wait a minute, now I can't remember. Was he cheap? Was he funny at home? And the answer is no. Did he play the violin? And my answer is not very well. I'll explain that later. And how does it feel to be adopted? Well, it was very simple because my father's best friend, you know who, had a daughter my age who was also adopted, and she had a little brother who was also adopted. So they were my best friends. They were the children I played with when we were in the sandbox. And it wasn't until I was 9 or 10 years old that I discovered there was another way to have children. To me, it was perfectly normal. I went to an adoption agency and said, I'll take that one.
We're all told, right?
Funny, huh?
Go to the baby store.
Exactly.
Oh, that's lovely. So when you were very young, you were adopted here, but you immediately moved, you and your family.
I was
grew up in LA.
I was a year old. My parents lived here in New York. My father had just finished with vaudeville and just started on radio, and the talent was all in Hollywood. And people in early radio were learning that they better move to Hollywood if they wanted guest stars on their shows and so on. And so I think Natty and Googie moved first, and a year later my parents moved to Beverly Hills.
And that's where you grew up. They were there, so you grew up your entire childhood there.
Yes.
Would you describe it as lap of luxury? Did you feel that way growing up?
I don't think I felt any different because
They're
my
Midwestern.
parents'
Your father
friends
is a
were.
Midwestern. He grew up in the Midwest.
Yeah, he grew up in Waukegan, Illinois. But when we moved to Hollywood, he had just started to do very well, and they built a house on North Roxbury Drive that was quite lavish. Now, everything is relative. It wasn't lavish compared to Daryl Zanuck's house or Jack Warner's house, or there were other houses that were far more. But we lived in a very beautiful house. And again, like being adopted, all my friends were celebrities' children. So to me it was, doesn't everybody? It seemed perfectly normal. I was aware that he was a celebrity. Also, my mother's two closest friends when I was growing up were Barbara Stanwyck and Claudette Colbert.
Yeah.
So they were Aunt Barbara and Aunt Claudette. But I knew they were movie stars. So it was always, even young, there was always Jekyll and Hyde. There was Daddy, who was Daddy, and there was Jack Benny, the star. And I learned at an early age to kind of separate them, and to know that my life, going to the studio on Sundays, being the celebrity's daughter, getting the red carpet treatment, all the things that go with celebrity, I kind of knew, and I don't know how I knew it, but I knew that that was fantasy, and that was not the real world. And so I learned to separate, and loved every minute of the fantasy. I enjoyed every moment of the fantasy, but I also knew that there was another world there, that you made your bed and took the trash out and washed the bathroom, I guess.
So your father, toward the end of your high school years, started into television.
Yes.
So that was about 48, 49.
He was started in television when I was in high school. I went to a boarding school very near Los Angeles. It was only an hour away from home, so I came home on weekends. But I remember when I was at the boarding school that he had just started to do television when I was junior or senior.
So would you come and would you visit his television set or show, or were you were you around to see him do that kind of work?
Well, I was at boarding school, so there came a time in my life, like most teenagers, where I was far more concerned with my life. I was far more concerned with a boyfriend or what was going on in school. And when I went to college, you know, being a cheerleader and doing all the college things, and far less interested in my parents' lives.
Well, we should talk about college too. So you went to Stanford
I went to Stanford.
and studied economics.
Yeah,
And
well,
other things,
that's another story.
Talk to me about, and maybe there's nothing to it, and maybe your parents said, great, more education is given, but neither of them went to college.
No,
Right?
my
So were you
father
the
hardly made it to high school.
Were you the first on both sides to kind of do
Yeah.
that?
Yes, but
And
then I was an only child, so there weren't any others to compete. But my
Was it
mother
something you had to
finished high
fight for?
school. My father, I don't think he made it quite through his freshman year in high school. And he played the violin, but we'll get to that later. He got a job playing the violin in the local vaudeville house, the Berenson Theater. And that's how he began in show business. And he was only maybe 15. He wanted to leave home and go on the road. Turns out the Marx Brothers came to Waukegan and they played the Berenson Theater. Now, I think this was before they were even the Marx Brothers. I think they had their original names at that time. And my father was the violinist, and their mother, Minnie, took a liking to my dad and asked him if he would go on the road in vaudeville with her and her sons. And he was dying to do that, but his parents wouldn't let him leave home until he was 18. And at 18, he did indeed leave home. And I'll tell you all about that if you want to hear about it.
There's so many directions. My brain is still stuck with Barbara Stanwyck. But
Oh, I
we'll talk
adore
about
her.
that.
Oh, I love Barbara Stanwyck.
Before we go on, let's talk about Barbara Stanwyck for just a second.
Yes.
So she was a family friend. She was a familiar. She might
Yes.
be.
She was Aunt Barbara.
Aunt Barbara's coming over for
Yeah,
drinks or
sure.
dinner or
Sit by the
whatever.
pool or whatever.
Tell me, tell me a story about that. So was she reserved?
I
Was
don't
she
have a story about
down
it
to
other
earth?
than
Was she?
she had a son who went through a lot of different names, but when I knew him, they called him Skip. His name was originally Dion. This is a whole, forget Jack Benny, this is a whole other lecture about her. And she was married to Frank Fay, and they adopted a little boy. She divorced Frank Fay. She then got involved with Robert Taylor, who she was wild about, and this kid was really in her way. I didn't know that at the time. I found this out much later, but apparently he had a very sad life. But when I knew him, he was adorable. He had freckles and Skip, and he was my first boyfriend. He was about 6 years old.
So he'd come over with Aunt
Oh,
Barbara
yes, he
to
came over
play
to
at the
play.
pool or whatever.
And we rode our two-wheelers together up and down the street. Yeah.
Okay. There's a little Barbara segue. So, and it's these parallel stories, and I guess because of the structure of the book, I think of it as a parallel story that, and if you want to just drop back into just talking about your dad for a while, that's cool. I'm sure people have questions. But I'm curious about your path through this, this entertainment family that you grew up in, and so you chose an academic route, and you got married pretty quickly. Did you, before you graduated,
Yeah.
While you were still in college?
Yeah. I did.
You got married, had your first child, and that marriage didn't last very long.
Got divorced.
Got
Then
divorced.
I got married again, had a second child. And I got divorced again, got married the third time, and had 2 more children.
Oh dear.
Wow.
Well, I don't know, but I think when we first met, we met last week, and we talked for, I felt like half an hour, but delightedly, about her children and her grandchildren and all their successes, and it was really.
My favorite subject was.
Well, it was terrific, and they
Everybody
all
loves to
went
talk
on
about
to,
their
they all went on to higher education and accomplished grandchildren. So everything turned out okay. So it's not, I didn't mean to bring up the
No, it
marriages
turned out
just-
marvelous. It just couldn't have been better.
So somewhere in there, you caught the acting bug yourself?
Never.
No. No?
Never.
You did some television?
I did talk shows. That's very different from acting. I could be me, as you could see. I could do this for another 3 hours. I'm very good at talking, but I had no talent whatsoever as an actress. My parents would have loved it. I did go to acting school about 3 or 4 sessions. I hated it. I think you don't like things you're not good at, and you do enjoy things you are good at. I was good at arithmetic when I was a little girl. My parents said, "Did you get the lead in the school play?" I said, "No, I played a tree." But I got an A in arithmetic, which they didn't understand at all. That's, when it comes to adoption, I don't know who my blood parents were. However, genetics is very strong because I was born with numbers in my head. And I loved math. I loved arithmetic. I loved playing with numbers. And it must have been genetic.
And your children inherited it.
My children inherited.
They're in fields that are related to this.
Pardon me?
They're in fields that are related to math and science.
And unfortunately, not a creative bone in my body. I flunked first grade art.
Well, this is pretty creative.
No, I just didn't get. I could no more write a story. I can only write truth. I mean, I could write nonfiction. I was very good at school at doing research papers. I loved doing research. But to make up a story, Dick and Jane went to school, and then I'm stuck.
Well, what was your compulsion to write this book? So there was you wanted to serve the memory of your father, and there's a manuscript that maybe you wanted to see the light of day, and you had some of your own story to flesh it out.
I had been asked so many times by publishers would I write a book about my father, and I thought about it, as I mentioned. I'm being repetitious now, but I was on an airplane on my way to California, and I was sitting next to a gentleman who turned out to be a very well-known writer, and it was a long flight, so we started talking, and I said, "I know this is what would be considered chutzpah, but I want to write a book about my father, and I don't know where to begin." That was the biggest problem now that I had the idea to do it. Where do I begin? And he said, "You begin with your strongest memory," just like that. And I went, "Oh, driving to the beach on Sundays." I mean, it was like that. And that's how I started the book, with a story about, which is in the beginning of the book. And that's, I would never have figured out how to start.
Well, I'll let you, tempt you to read the book, to hear that story. Well, there were a couple of examples of things in here that I thought we might draw upon, and we can ask questions, or people can ask questions. But along the vein of, I was just flipping through the book over the last couple of days, and because you can Google things and find things on YouTube, you can find some of your appearances with your father in the early 60s on shows like
To Tell the Truth.
And Password. Yeah, you can easily find them, really, it's not a secret. Her name and her father's name, and either of those shows, they'll come up for you. And it made me curious about that particular time, or that particular era. And so I went to one of the chapters that addressed that, and there's a story here, maybe you'll remember, I won't read it, but you'll remember this. You tell the story of coming to do a week of performances at, which show was it? It doesn't really matter. I'll say it To Tell the Truth. And you were staying at the Sherry Netherland, and you just happened to your dad happened to be staying there. You hadn't compared notes. He was there for entirely different reasons.
I remember that.
And he invited you to tell something else about his personality.
Oh, does he owe Calcutta?
Well, this is one where he invited you to a baby, but it was a fancy dress. You didn't have the appropriate
he took me
dress.
shopping at Bergdorf Goodman.
Yes, and it seemed like a
I hadn't thought of that in years.
sweet story about a father acknowledging his grown-up daughter and his generosity of spirit. And
Oh, that was,
can you tell
yeah,
the story?
wow.
Very sweet. So you run into each other. You're an adult young woman.
Yeah, I came to New York to do some talk shows, and I walked out, I was staying at the Sherry Neverland, because that's where I'd always stayed as a child. And in the lobby, there's my dad. Now,
This is
we were
maybe
very
60.
close, however, I was now married and had children, so we didn't keep track of each other, as far as my father would come to New York for 3 days, or he would go to Chicago or wherever. And so we didn't always know where the other person was, so there he was. And there was a fancy dress ball of some sort. And I said, I don't have an evening gown. We go to Bergdorf Goodman. He was so cute. We go up to where the gowns are, and he has a raincoat with him and his hat, and more hats in those days. And the sales lady sits him down, and he's sitting on a chair with the coat and a hat on his lap. I mean, he's so sweet. He's sitting there waiting for me to try on clothes. So the lady brings me 3 dresses, one very demure and very appropriate, and I came out in that, and he said, oh, I love that. What else is there? Well, the second dress was silver lame, and it was backless. And it was a dress, you couldn't even wear a bra under it. It was skin tight. Well, I tried this on, and I was maybe 22, had a good figure in those days, and I looked in the mirror and I thought, oh my God, you're smashing. However, there's no way, your father's going to approve of this. So I thought, well, I'll show him anyway and see what awful thing he has to say. So I come out in this silver lame dress. He loved it. He absolutely loved it. I didn't get that one. I got the
I thought part of it, well, that's lovely, that he loved her, and I thought the way you wrote about it was that he actually wanted both of them.
He did. But he did, and I remember wearing that silver lame gown, but not that
later.
night with him.
But no, yes. So more the backless later on your own time.
Yes, yes.
That's lovely. I wonder if we should ask questions, or let the audience
Well,
ask questions, or
perhaps
if
we
you want
can
to
talk about his violin playing.
about.
Do you all want to know about his
Yeah.
violin?
Yes.
Well, guys, that's one of that and what was Rochester like, and which I don't have an answer. Let me explain Rochester first, and that will explain a lot of the cast and so on, if you're curious. Men have 3 categories of friends. You have your buddies who you play golf with or go bowling with. You have your couple friends, you and your wife go out to dinner with another couple. And then you have your business friends, and those are people you see at the office, but they're not necessarily personal friends. Well, that was the case of the cast of the show. And if you ask me about Dennis Day or Phil Harris or Don Wilson or Rochester, the fact is they were not personal friends. I saw them on Sundays when I went to see the show being done. My father saw them 2 or 3 days a week during rehearsals and then the shows, and they all liked each other a lot, but they weren't personal friends. They didn't come to our house for dinner, we didn't go to their house for dinner. The only one who was an exception to that was Mel Blanc, and he was a buddy of my father's, and I adored Mel Blanc, as you can well imagine. The poor man, I drove him crazy. I never saw that man that I didn't say, do Tweety Bird, do Bugs Bunny. He was so dear, and whatever it was, he would always do these wonderful characters, and I loved Mel. Now to Violet. His mother, my grandmother, I never met her, she died before I was born. She wanted him to be a concert violinist before he was born. So when he was a very little boy, they bought him a little miniature violin, and he took violin lessons all through his childhood. The problem was that he really liked to daydream. They lived with a view of Lake Michigan, and he would sit and look out on the lake and dream of faraway places. Hated practicing. But he practiced enough to be quite competent, or he would have gotten a job at Berenson Theater. Then, when he became 18, he left home. There was a woman named Cora Salisbury, And they went out on the road and they did a vaudeville act. She played piano, he played violin, and they did sort of semi-classical. And they didn't go terribly far from Chicago. They played theaters in that region. Then came the First World War. He joined the Navy. He was stationed at the Great Lakes Naval Training Station, which was not far from Waukegan. And he played in the orchestra there. And one day, Pat O'Brien, the actor, who was also at that place, at that station, asked him if he would participate in a show they were doing and do a speaking part. And he said, okay. And it was a comedy part. So he read comedy lines, and the audience laughed. And he said, I like that. I love having people laugh. So, when he went back on the road after the war, he had a different partner, and they did the same thing. They played piano, violin, but in between pieces, he told jokes. And he started playing the violin a little bit less, telling jokes a little bit more, and one thing led to another, and the rest you know. He wound up not playing the violin at all and becoming a comedian. And then he went into radio. Now the years go by. Now my dad is in his 50s, and he decides he wants to play the violin again. He gets a violin teacher, and he starts taking lessons, and he's very serious about it. The problem was that because of his age, he had had a slight hearing loss. And as you know, when you play the violin, you have to have perfect ears. You have to be able to hear whether you're flat or sharp, where you put the pressure on the string. And he couldn't hear that. And by the way, he practiced in his dressing room and occasionally his bathroom, because my mother hated the sound of the practicing. So I would sometimes go in his dressing room and listen to him practice and say, Daddy, you're sharp on the D. And he would say, no, I'm not. He really couldn't hear it. So when he played the concerts, as you probably know, he played with every major orchestra in the United States and raised a lot of money for the musicians' pension funds. But when he played these concerts, he was really playing as well as he could. So many people think he was playing it for laughs, he was playing it to be funny. He wasn't. He was playing it as well as he could. But he would have given up comedy. He was crazy about Isaac Stern. They were best friends. He would have given up comedy in a New York Minute to be a concert violinist. Isaac Stern, by the way, who was a very close friend of ours, had a wonderful line. He said to me one day, you know, when your father walks out on the stage at Carnegie Hall in his white tie and tails, he looks so elegant, so handsome. It's a shame he has to play. Then there was a review of his concert at Carnegie Hall in the Times the next day, or perhaps it was the Post, that was headlined, Benny plays Mendelssohn, Mendelssohn lost. Wonderful stories about his violin. But on a serious note, what the great fun that I had with my dad, that I played piano, and we used to play piano-violin duets, very badly, but we really had fun doing that.
Oh, it's classical? Classical?
Oh, yes, yes. The Mozart piano-violin sonatas.
That would be a fun little recording to find.
Well, it reminds me of a night that we were at their house. They were having a little party, and after dinner, it was decided that everybody would entertain. Everybody would do just a brief something or other, but it couldn't be what you normally did, and there were a lot of celebrities there. So people did their thing, whatever it was, and finally my father was the host, and somebody said, you know, come on, Jack, you do something. And I said, Daddy, let's play piano violin. So he gets his violin, and we start to play this, as I said, rather badly. Now, Jack Lemmon was sitting on the sofa. Jack Lemmon, as you may know, was a fairly decent drinker. and he was a little smashed. And he's listening to this, and the next thing I see, the tears are running down his face. Jack Lemmon is saying, "Aren't they sweet?" It was so funny.
Did you think it was funny at the time?
Aren't they sweet?
There's one story I was reading about, I can't remember if it was in your book or some other source on Dad's kind of, all his accomplishments. We haven't talked about his films. And I was thinking about To Be or Not to Be.
To Be or Not to Be was a great film.
Yeah.
But it was a great Lubitsch film.
Yeah.
I'm afraid to say, I don't know that I'd say this in front of my father. My father was not a good actor. My father was Jack Benny, and he played Jack Benny, and he couldn't be anything but Jack Benny. So he was not a good actor. There's a lot of comedians who are good actors. My father was not one of them. However, Lubitsch, who was a great director, wanted the part of Joseph Tura to be played by Jack Benny. And that's exactly what he was, and thanks to Lubitsch, in casting him in that, it was a great movie. And so, you know, people think, gee, your father was wonderful in that. Well, my father was himself, but yes, he was wonderful in that. It was a wonderful movie. The rest of the movies he made are, for the most part, pretty forgettable, including the Horn Blows.
And he moved on to television and the rest of his.
Pardon me?
And he moved on to television and the rest of his legacy. After that, yeah. I really want to give folks a chance to ask you their favorite question or the thing that's present.
Before you do, I have to tell the Bobby story.
Okay.
I told you
Yes, you did.
my Bobby story. I have 4 children. The 2 youngest are Bobby and Joanna. Bobby was, at this time, about 7 years old, and we went out to dinner, and we walked into a restaurant, and my father was greeted, big greeting, you know, "Oh yes, Mr. Benny," he's shown to the table, and we're following along. And I have Bobby, my hand over here. Bobby looks up, he says, "Mommy, is Granddaddy famous?" And I said, "Yes, honey, Granddaddy's famous." Pause. "Are we famous?" I said, "Yes, I've got a sister. Are we famous?" I said, "No, honey, you're not famous." He said, "Well, we're pretty well known for our age." I have to tell that story.
I have one more story that I just got this, my own story about you last week over lunch. So we're having lunch at a restaurant at Bloomingdale's. And I ordered this fabulous salad. It's a Cobb salad. Had big chunks of blue cheese and all the appropriate ingredients in it.
Oh God, yes.
But this is great. We're just getting to know each other, but I thought this was beautiful. The big chunks of everything. And we've been chatting for a little while about other things, and you said quietly, "So what kind of salad did you get?" And I said, "It's a Cobb salad. It's got all the ingredients." She said,
"No, it's not.
"That's not a Cobb salad." He said, I was with Bob Cobb when he created that." But you didn't say that in the red. It was just an attention to detail and correctness. She said, "I know the way it's. I mean, I know the way it's supposed to be diced up and all that, up in the little rows."
Yeah, exactly.
This was
I wasn't with Bob Cobb when he made the salad, but I was going to the Brown Derby at that time, and I knew him, and he is the man who invented the Cobb salad.
I just love that. So attention to detail, and she's been everywhere, and she knows these folks, and she swam with Barbara Stanwyck. And I'm thrilled. So the book itself is worth reading I'm a dramaturg, so I think this way, but structurally, what she managed to do, incorporating her own life with the life of her father, and creating a rather elegant combination. And I did note, this doesn't have to be the last word before we open up, but I did note, as I was flipping through, you gave your father the last word in the
I
book.
hope so.
And
I'd be embarrassed.
no, it was lovely. You know, I wondered if you could read it, or I could read it, or they're his words from his.
Oh, I think I know what you're talking about.
Well,
Yeah.
and he's summing up just a couple of sentences that I just thought were really lovely.
Mhm.
Do you want me to just read
No,
them?
please
They're
read.
still here.
Please.
So it's it's her book, it's her father's, right? My whole life, it is if I were a passenger on a train. I don't want to be on the train, but I have no strong desire to get off either. I don't know where the train's going, but meanwhile, I will count the telephone poles and watch the scenery and see what the other passengers have in mind. And then, when the train arrives at the last station, I get off. I look around. I like the place where I am. I don't know exactly how I got there, but I'm glad to be here just the same.
Oh, sweet. That was my dad. That's so much his life. Yeah.
Well, there we go. It's just delightful.
He was a really nice man. He was a wonderful father, and I frequently said he was the nicest man I've known. And it's true. He was a lovely, gentle man who, although he never had any schooling to speak of, was one of the smartest men, certainly about his career and about show business in general. There have been many stories about him, but one of my favorites had to do with, and I won't bore you with the whole story, but had to do with somebody who was an opening act, and she wanted on the marquee, she wanted her letters to be as big as the Star's letters. So when she got to the theater, the letters were different, and my father said, and this was what I said, my father was so smart, he said, don't you understand, it doesn't matter what size your letters are on the marquee, the audience knows who the star is, they don't need to be told about the size of the letters, and I think that was so smart, because he's absolutely right. He was never jealous of other comedians. He always tried to help young comedians. He wanted them to do well. Again, he had a theory that the more good comedians there are, the better it is for comedy. You don't want to be somebody not to be good so that you'll be better. Not at all. Everybody should be good because it's good for comedy.
Oh.
Very smart man.
He was.
Humbly. There's always something, an additional lovely thing to learn about. So are there things that surprised you when you looked through the memoir? Or
I don't think so. I think I pretty well knew most of it.
So you didn't have lurking secrets?
I knew the writers. I've been asked so often, was he funny at home? And the answer is no. He wasn't funny at home. He wasn't a wit. George Burns was a wit.
Yeah.
And as you all know, people like Georges Kaufman, Dorothy Parker, they were witty. My father was never witty. And I asked one of his writers about that. And he said, no, you're right, your father was not a wit. He said, but what he had was a great sense of humor.
Interesting.
Absolutely right. He was a great editor. He knew when to cut a story or whatever, not to let it go on too long. That was one of his greatest talents, was as an editor.
Understood the rhythm of storytelling.
Oh, did he ever? Yes. Certainly he taught me, and certainly in telling jokes, the rhythm of the story. Never add an extra word to a punchline. You'll destroy the rhythm, and so on. I'd be happy to take questions. However, is it possible to bring the light? I know you probably see the lights on, but I can't see anybody. I can see your pants. I can see the bottom of your pants, that's all.
Here's Magda.
Hi.
Oh, there,
Hi.
thank you.
First question. About your mother and father's relationship. What was the relationship like? And was your mother, she was on the show, but I never felt like she was really an actress. Was she an actress? I don't know too much about her.
No, well, if you're interested, the story, how did she get on the show? The writers, this is also to Rochester. Early on in radio, the writers, my father was moving to Los Angeles, which was true. He was taking the train, and they wrote a show about it. And they needed a porter, a train porter. And they interviewed a lot of people, and they hired this man, Eddie Anderson. And the writers gave him the name Rochester. Rochester was the railroad porter. Well, he was so wonderful that they wanted to keep him on the show. They couldn't keep going back and forth from New York to Los Angeles, so he became sort of the valet cum steward, whatever he was. And Rochester became so Rochester, even his wife called him Rochester. Nobody ever called him Eddie Anderson again. He became Rochester. My mother, similar story. She, the writers wrote a part for a fan named Mary Livingston, come up to my father and asked him for his autograph. And the actress who was supposed to play the part got sick. And my father said, you know, Mary, will you, she wasn't Mary, she was Sadie. Her name was Sadie Marks. So my father says, Sadie, will you play that part? And she did, and that's how she became Mary Livingston. The writers wrote that name. And then she wound up changing her name from Sadie Marks to Mary Livingston legally. So that's that story. Yes.
You mentioned Frank Fay, who was the first husband of Barbara Stanwyck. Very interesting. He was the comedian's comedian. He was the first modern stand-up comic. Didn't rely on funny clothes or a characterization.
You're right.
Just came out as himself.
Yeah, I heard all about that.
And as a wit, he was not to be. Even Groucho Marx couldn't approach this guy.
Yeah, I've heard that.
Now, two comments about him. Many comedians were influenced by him a lot. Bob Hope said, "What I did was to speed up Frank Fay." Jack Benny said, "What I did was to slow down Frank Fay."
Frank Fay was a fabulous comic. He was also a dreadful person.
I understand that, yes.
Not telling tales, everybody knew he was a dreadful person. It's not, it was common knowledge. Yes.
I know that, and you spoke of the fact that your father met the Marx Brothers in their vaudeville days, and then when they were all stars in Hollywood, I know they were at least acquaintance level friends, and I think a little closer than that. Did you ever get to meet any of the Marx Brothers, and do you have memories of that?
I met Groucho a few times. I didn't know him well, but I met him at a party here and there. And I knew Zeppo and Zeppo's wife.
They were close to Barbara Stanwyck.
Yes,
Yeah.
they were.
Yeah.
You're right. And I spent a lot of time in Palm Springs, and Marion, his first wife, Zeppo's first wife, they were at the Racket Club all the time, so I knew them from the Racket Club. Or I knew Marion. I didn't know Zeppo. Zeppo was always playing cards. Yes.
Yes, I do have a question. My husband, who's not here tonight, but he's old enough to have remembered the radio show and all the shows of that era. And then the transition into television. And he always has said that he loved the comedy of the radio show because your imagination would just, you'd think about how it was being done.
No question.
And the pauses between, you'd fill them in with your own mind.
Well, I certainly felt that way.
So my question
Yes.
is, did your father ever speak about, how did he adjust to the transition? Did he like going from radio to television, or was that difficult for him, or?
No, I think that what Martha read to you, the last line of his book, what he said was, I don't know where I'm getting off or what it is, but whatever it is fine. That was how he treated life. I mean, he just did what was there. And I don't remember him really talking a lot about it being
So
a
they
problem
just took
or whatever.
the
He
radio
simply did it because
show
that's what you did.
and then made it into the TV, and now all of a sudden he was on camera and Rochester, and they.
Well, he had made movies, so he certainly knew how to do to work on the stage.
And
But
did he ever
just
say,
made the
"Oh"?
transition, because that's what you did.
Did he ever say, "Oh, I wish I was still on radio"?
No,
Okay.
at least if he did, I don't recall that. No, he went with the flow. Yes.
Tell us a little bit about your career.
I didn't have much of a career. I've done a little of a lot of things. the one that's the most impressive. Are you ready for this title? I was, on my resume, I was the assistant to the director of the Center for Medieval and Renaissance Studies at UCLA. The truth is, I had done a lot of charity work when I was married and had children, and I worked for charities, and I put on premieres, I put on gala balls, and I was very experienced in organizing that kind of thing. The gentleman who was the director of the center was a good friend of mine, and he knew what I did and so on. And he approached me, would I consider doing that job? And I said, Frady, I don't know squat about medieval and Renaissance studies. He said, you don't need to, you just need to be able to organize our symposia and our conferences and put on a closing banquet and an opening banquet. And I said, okay. So that's how I got that highfalutin title. It sounds wonderful, doesn't it?
Question.
So that's something I did for a
One in
while.
the back.
I wanted to find out, your father had the reputation of going down in his bank vault and, that he was cheap. Why did they make him out to be cheap?
Oh, well, that's I think, and I don't know the right answer really, but I think that the cheap character probably started in vaudeville. He was in vaudeville. I think this is kind of interesting, and I didn't know this until I wrote the book and started researching. It never occurred to me that, he went into vaudeville when he was 18. He started in radio in 1932. He was in vaudeville for over 20 years before he went onto radio. So that's a lot of experience. Not like performers today don't begin to have that kind of time to get that kind of experience. And I think that he developed that character in vaudeville and then built on it when he went into radio. Or maybe the writers wrote it and he developed it in radio. I don't know the exact answer.
He played it so well.
Yes.
Did your father leave us papers or memorabilia with any institutions?
A lot of it is at UCLA, and some of it is at the University of Wyoming.
Why Wyoming?
Yeah. Why?
You want the truth? The honest to God truth? Okay. I don't think I've ever told this. My mother died 10 years after my father, and when she died, they had like a guest house on the premises of they had a big home in Holmby Hills, and it was like 3 acres, and there was another house on the grounds that was an office. I had never been in it. My mother died, now it's all mine, so I go to this office, and there's 3 rooms, as big as this room, filled with memorabilia and just everything imaginable. And I looked at it all, and I walked out and closed the door. I said, what do I do? And somebody told me about an archivist named Chuck Sachs. So I called Chuck Sachs. He came over. He looked at all this stuff, and he said, oh, this is not a problem. I said, it isn't? And I said, no, this is what I do. He said, I'll take care of it.
Archivists are magic people. They're amazing.
Yeah, he had done the Warner Brothers archive.
Wow.
Anyway, so he said, what do you want me to do with it? Are you going to sell it? Do you want to donate? I said, well, I guess I should donate it to UCLA because that's where a lot of stuff he had already given to UCLA. And he said, okay. He said, he said, let me check with them. Calls me back. He said, UCLA would love to have it, but they can't pay for it. Naive. I said, pay for what? He said, pay for me. I said, oh, you get paid. He said, yes, and he gave me a very large amount. And he said, but let me check further. So he calls me and he said, the University of Wyoming would love to have this archive and they'll pay for it. I said, they've got it.
Great. Thanks.
That's the truth.
Very good.
Joan, one of the questions for our online watchers He wants to know if you can confirm that your dad was known as the sweetest friend that one could have.
The sweetest friend that one could have?
Yes.
No question about it. Absolutely true.
Can you give us any examples of that you might recall?
Well, I think all his friends could probably tell you that. I can't think of anybody in particular. Hannah, can you?
No, I'm thinking.
You're thinking. This lady here in the red, her name is Hannah Pakula, and Hannah and I met in the 2nd grade. She had moved to Beverly Hills from Omaha, and we became best friends, and she was at my house a lot. Now, I have to tell you that Hannah, she's still beautiful, but she was a gorgeous child. And my father loved pretty girls, didn't matter what age, and he adored Hannah. Hannah was the favorite of my friends. So we've known each other all these years, which is a very long time. And I thought you might be able to remember something.
Sweetest,
Pardon me?
kindest man.
He was the kindest man.
And the sweetest.
Yeah. Anybody?
May I ask a second question? I don't want to be greedy, but who, besides George Burns, who I'm guessing made your father laugh since they were best friends, who were the funny man that made your father laugh the most? Who did he most admire?
Well, mainly George Burns. Do you all know some of the George Burns stories?
No.
Oh.
Involving the two of them?
Well, the two of them had a relationship that I can only tell you was symbiotic. George could just lift his finger and my father was on the floor laughing. My father could not make George laugh, no matter what. He drove him crazy, and the fact is that the relationship was so crazy that the better you knew them, like me and my mother and Gracie, the better you knew them, the funnier it was, because you knew something was going to happen. If you were with the two of them together, you were just waiting. And it all began in vaudeville when they met each other, and apparently they were on the telephone. I don't know who called who. And George hung up in the middle of the phone call. What really happened was the phone went dead, but my father thought that George had hung up deliberately. And he thought that was terribly funny. And he thought it was done as a joke. So from that time on, whenever they spoke on the phone, Natty always hung up in the middle of the conversation. And many years later, one of the actors on the show, Benny Rubin, bet my father that if he called Natty, the next time he called him, that he wouldn't hang up on him. And so my father took the $50 bet and calls George. They talk for a while, and Natty doesn't hang up, and he doesn't hang up, and he doesn't hang up. And finally my father says, "George, why aren't you hanging up on me?" And Natty says, "Because I have half of Benny's bet." He would drive up on Sunset Boulevard. Natty would be driving his car. My father loved to walk. He would walk all over Beverly Hills all the time. And he would see Natty and cross the street to talk to him. As soon as he got to the car, Natty drove away. These things, one of the stories was Louis B. Mayer had a party one night many years ago to introduce Jeanette MacDonald, who they had just signed at MGM. And if they were going to have a little salon after dinner, and Jeanette was going to sing. So the seats are all kind of like yours here, and Natty was sitting right behind my father. The pianist plays an intro, at which point Natty leans over and says, "Jack, if you were to laugh, it would be very rude." Well, that was the end of that. And things like that, there's so many more. Those stories were just hysterical, and I mean, they never stopped. And it got so bad that to the point where my father walked into Hillcrest Country Club, and Natty was sitting there, and after a few minutes, my father started laughing, and Natty said, "What are you laughing at? I haven't done anything." And my father says, but you're doing it on purpose. They were crazy. Yes.
Maybe it was mentioned, I'm sorry, did they meet in vaudeville?
Yes.
Did they ever work together as a team?
No, they never worked together.
But they were in the
No,
same
Natty worked
show?
with Gracie.
Okay, right, always.
And before that, Natty worked with a dancer. He was married. Not too many people know that Natty was married before he married Gracie.
Oh.
He was very briefly married to a dancer.
So they would be in the same show, but not on the same,
They might have been at the same theater at the same time.
not
I
in
don't
the
know.
same
I don't know that they
house
ever were.
parties. I see.
Well, when George married Gracie, they were in St. Louis, I believe, and my father heard about it and called the hotel to congratulate them. And he answered the phone, knowing it was my father, and said, "We want 2 ham sandwiches and." My father, patsy that he was, called back, and before he could say anything, Natty said, "And French fries on the side." They were crazy.
How did your parents meet? Do you know that?
They met, I believe, through my aunt. My mother's sister was in vaudeville. She worked with she was married to a man at the time who was sort of a small-time performer. And they had a vaudeville act. And they were on the same bill as my father at a theater in Los Angeles. And they arranged for my mother to meet my father on a blind date. That's how they met. Yes.
At the beginning of your interview, you seem to want to tell a story about Old Calcutta. I'm curious what you were going to say.
Sorry?
At the beginning of your interview, you started to say about a story about Old Calcutta, and then you
Oh my God!
interrupted.
Yes.
I'm just curious. It sounds like a
You
good
all
one.
remember. Okay, there's another time at the Sherry Netherland. It may have been the same trip, I'm not sure. But I ran into my dad in the lobby of the Sherry Netherland, and he said, "I'm going to see Old Calcutta tonight. Do you want to come with me?" And then he said, "Wait a minute, I'd better ask your mother. I don't think I should take you to that." Now, I was in my early 30s.
Yeah.
I had 4 children. And so he called my mother, who said it would be okay. So he was really embarrassed. He did not want to take me to that show. But we saw it, and it was okay. But
Did you ever know Fred Allen and his wife, Portland Papa?
my father was very friendly with them, and I knew them slightly. But of course, they lived in New York, as you know, and we lived in California. My father and Fred were very good friends, and they admired each other a lot, and they liked each other a lot. I didn't know them well because I was rarely in New York long enough to spend time with them. And if they spent time with my parents, it was probably going out to dinner. Excuse me, to which I wasn't invited. Oh, sorry, I'm taking over a cold. Okay, sorry. Anybody else? I guess not. Thank you. You've been a wonderful audience.
Thank you.